Today's daf we're going to be learning is Menachot Daf Ayin Tet. I will just remind everyone that tomorrow's Erev Pesach. We're going to learn as normal, as usual on Zoom. And then after that, the rest of Pesach is all pre-recorded and it's all found already on the site. So if you want to get ahead and learn some of the dapim, they're actually most of them are shorter than usual, which is helpful for the Chag, especially if you have a few to catch up on with a 3-day Chag. So if you want to get started on them, you can. Again, it's always a little tricky to go out of order, but you can once in a while. It's okay. Okay, we're going to get started with the Mishnah at the bottom of Ayin Chet Amud Bet. And I'll also just remind you one more thing, which is that there's shiurim relating to Pesach, and some of them also relating to Pesach in our daf. Nicely that we had a lot of connections already between Pesach and the daf, so they're up on the site and the beyond the daf. You can find them. And like I said, there's Pesach learning in general from older shiurim that are all connected topically to Pesach. Okay, so starting with the Mishnah now, at the bottom of Ayin Chet Amud Bet. Shachata chutz lizmanav v'chutz l'mkoma. I'll tell you before we start this Mishnah, we're going to read the Mishnah. The Mishnah is basically one approach. It's the approach of Rabbi Meir, which often happens, that a Stam Mishnah is Rabbi Meir. And then we're going to see in the Gemara is going to say, oh, by the way, this is Rabbi Meir, but Rabbi Yehuda has a different version. And then we're going to learn Rabbi Yehuda, and then we're going to try to figure out the difference. There's one obvious difference between them, but what the difference is between them in terms of why there's a difference between them. The other thing, before we get started, I'll remind you of a sugya we learned in Tzvachim, which is this concept. If you remember, we've learned that there's a lot of things that if you put them on the altar, you're not supposed to put them on the altar, they're disqualified. But if you put them on the altar, we don't take them off. If you remember, im ala lo yered, or im alta lo tered. Okay, if it already went up, we don't have to take it off. And there's other things that are so disqualified that if we put them on the altar, we have to take them down. And the usual distinction, although there's some exceptions to the rule, is psulo b'kodesh, if it got disqualified in the sanctuary, meaning, okay, you did something wrong throughout the process, then if it already went up, we're going to leave it there because when it got into the sanctuary, it actually was fine. And it only got ruined because of a process, something we did wrong. But there's things that were disqualified to begin with. Like, let's say it's a treifa. Now, often you don't know the animal is a treifa until you slaughter it, and then you open it, and then you find out there was something wrong inside the animal, and it was a treifa, which could never have been brought on the altar in the first place. That is super disqualified because it was no good before it even came in, and therefore, if it goes up on the altar, you have to take it off. So that's going to be the basis for what we're going to talk about today, which is, or at least part of the basis, and then we're going to have some exceptions, we're going to have to deal with them. But basically, we talked about yesterday that when you slaughter the korban, the animal that goes with the Thanksgiving offering, again, I just want to remind you, we keep talking about breads, but obviously there's an animal that goes here with the korban toda. It's a korban, not obviously, but yes, it says in the Torah, there's an animal, and you bring that with 40 loaves. So now the question is, when do the loaves become sanctified? And we learned that it's when you slaughter the animals, basically, the animal, the loaves get sanctified. And then we talked about, yesterday was, when you do that, the loaves have to be inside what we had a debate, the loaves have to be already baked, okay? And then there's certain times where if you didn't do that, it's not going to be sanctified. Now we're going to have all sorts of disqualified cases where you're slaughtering the animal and you do it, for example, chutz lizmana, your classic pigul case. You have the Kohen has a thought while he's slaughtering the animal that he's going to sprinkle the blood, let's say, for example, he's going to sprinkle the blood tomorrow, which is not allowed, and that's pigul. So that's our first case. Shchata chutz lizmana, or chutz l'mkoma, or you think, I'm going to actually sprinkle the blood outside the temple, kadash halechem. Well, that's a classic case of psulo b'kodesh. It got disqualified in the sanctuary. So because of that, if you would put it on the altar, we would leave it there, and therefore the bread actually will be sanctified. We're going to say basically it's enough of a slaughter, a case of slaughtering, that kadash halechem. Shchata v'nimtzei treifa lo kadash halechem. Okay, if you slaughtered it though, and it turns out it was a treifa, as I said before, then it won't be sanctified because that was a psul before it even came into the temple. So of course it's a problem. Okay, I'm going to actually share my screen because we'll see this all charted out, and it's helpful. Okay, so there's a study guide for today, and you can follow along. Okay, so chutz lizmana, chutz l'mkoma, it is sanctified. Treifa, no. Shchata v'nimtzeit ba'alat mum. Now, what would you expect if it's a ba'alat mum? It would be just like a treifa, and here's where things get a little bit strange. Rabbi Eliezer omer kadash, v'chachamim omrim lo kadash. Okay, the strange opinion here is Rabbi Eliezer. Why did Rabbi Eliezer say lo is kadash? it should be a balmum, should be completely disqualified. And therefore, if it would go on the altar, we would take it off. So it doesn't really make sense why he says the bread is sanctified. We're going to have to get back to this in the Gemara and figure out why he says this. Now we have another exception to the rule, which we actually saw in the Gemara yesterday, which is shachata. Was quoted in a bright, and they made reference to this halacha. Shchata shelo lishma. If you slaughtered it shelo lishma, we're going to see in a minute lo kadash. I just want to stop for a minute before we keep reading, because we're going to get a little off for a second. But if you do it shelo lishma, if you remember, it said im al todah yakriv. Al zevach todah shlamav. You're going to do it on the zevach of the korban todah. Which means if you do it for the sake of a different korban, they darshan. If you do it for the sake of a different korban, it's not going to work the breads, okay? Because the breads are done on a toda, not on a korban that you took that was a toda, but you accidentally, had in mind you're going to slaughter it as a sin offering or something like that, okay? Then it won't work. The bread is not sanctified, and that's because of a drasha from a pasuk. Theoretically, shalol lishma should be in the same category as chutz l'zmana and chutz l'koma, because it's something that happens in the sanctuary, right? It was fine before, it was only because you had the wrong intent. But because of a drasha from the pasuk, we're going to put it in the other category. Okay, but the line is a little bit longer in the Mishnah, and I stopped for a minute because I wanted to get to the basic halacha, but now we're going to see. Shchata shalol lishma, they're kind of breaking for a second. And by the way, not just in this korban, toda, chen ela miluim, v'chen shnei kivsei atzeret, 2 other sacrifices that come with bread. Notice which one's missing? The nazir is missing. Okay, we'll get back to that in the Gemara also. But just like the ela miluim, which comes, the one they did in the inauguration ceremony of the tabernacle, that had breads. And also the shnei kivsei atzeret, the 2 sheep offerings that goes with the 2 shnei alechem, the 2 loaves. Both those shachatan shelo lishma lo kadash alechem. Just like the toda, if you do those shelo lishma, the bread won't be sanctified. Okay, so now we get to the Gemara. Manitimani. Who does this Mishnah go according to? I already told you, Rabbi Meir. And now in the second chart on the page, I charted out Rabbi Meir's opinion, which completely matches what we saw here. Just shelo lishma part that isn't mentioned. Okay, it's not that they disagree. It's just not mentioned here. But otherwise, it's the exact same thing as our Mishnah. And then we're going to see Rabbi Yehuda's opinion in this Braita, who completely, partially disagrees with Rabbi Meir about one major thing. Okay, so let's see. Titanya, Zaklal, here's the rule. Now, here we get the rule, which we didn't see in our Mishnah, but I told you, which is kosha pisulo kodem shchita. If the disqualification happened before the slaughtering, okay, which means, again, usually that's before it even got into the azara, lo kadash alechem. It's not sanctified. So that's a more severe psul, disqualification. Pisulo achar shchita kadash alechem. But if it's after shchita, then yes, it would be sanctified. Shchata chutz lizmana, chutz l'mkoma. So now we're going through the cases. So after he gave the principle, now we have the cases. Chutz lizmana or chutz l'mkoma, kadash alechem. Shchata v'nimtzei trefa, lo kadash alechem. If it's a trefa, it's not. Shchata v'nimtzei balat mum, here's our machloket. Rabbi Eliezer omer kadesh. Kadash, Rabbi Yoshua Omer Lo Kadash. Okay, here you have the machloket. Notice it's Rabbi Yoshua and Chachamim in this case. Okay, just to point out who these characters are, we know them very well. Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkanus. Remember the Tanur Shalachnai story when he gets up and has his own unique opinion, and Rabbi Yoshua says, "I'm going to bring the heavens in to prove that you're wrong." Right? If the walls of the Beit Midrash, if this, they have this whole argument all the time. Right? They're very much balei machlokot. And Rabbi Yoshua generally represents the opinion of the Chachamim. And that's why in our Mishnah, Rabbi Yeshua's opinion is mentioned as the Chachamim, because that's the mainstream opinion. Rabbi Eliezer was anything but mainstream. Rabbi Eliezer and Horkanus always had these different opinions from the rabbis. So here also. Okay, that's all Divrei Rabbi Meir. Amar Rabbi Yehuda. Lo nechleku Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Yeshua al shechatav nimtzeit chefa shelo kadash. V'al chutz zmano shekadash. Okay, he first sets up where they don't argue. Now, what's interesting about Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda is they both agree that there's a machloket Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Yeshua about something here. So therefore, comes Rabbi Yehuda and says they don't disagree about the case of treifa. Okay, treifa, everyone agrees lo kadash alechem. Okay, and Rabbi Meir agrees with that also. Right, everyone agrees. Both Rabbi Yehuda says Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua don't disagree, and even Rabbi Meir doesn't disagree with him about that. And al chutz lizmano shekadash, and everyone thinks that if you had a pigul machshava, your classic case of pigul, you slaughtered it to do chutz lizmano, for sure kadash alechem. That's a good enough slaughtering that the bread is sanctified. And al ba'amum shelo kadash. Now here's where he disagrees with Rabbi Meir. He says both Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua don't disagree about a Baal Mum. Of course, a Baal Mum, like we thought intuitively, is just like a treifa. Lo kadash alechem. It's not going to be sanctified. So amanekleku, what's left? Al chutz limkomo, she Rabbi Eliezer omer kadash, v'Rabbi Yeshua omer lo kadash. If it's chutz limkomo, and you said I'm going to do this outside, right? You have a machshava, a thought. The Kohen thinks I'm going to sprinkle the blood outside the Beit HaMikdash, okay, or outside the Asara even. That's where they have a machloket. Okay, now we're going to have to see why they have a machloket about this. In this case, okay, in the first case, Baal Mum, we said Rabbi Eliezer was strange. Why would he say Kadash? In this case, it's Rabbi Yeshua that's strange. Why does he say Lo Kadash, right? Because according to Rabbi Meir, everyone thinks Kadash Alechem, because both those cases, if it went on the altar, you would leave it there. The psul is in the Kodesh. So why does Rabbi Yeshua say Lo Kadash? Okay, we're going to have to figure that out. So now the Bright is going to continue here with a big discussion between a back and forth between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua, trying to prove their opinions. Okay, that's the next chart on the page. Amar Rabbi Eliezer. Ho'il, right, this is something we don't often have in our Mishnah. Conversations. Oh, I'm going to prove my point. Oh, I can prove mine from this. But often in a Tosefta or in a Braita, you will have a more elaborated opinion. I just want to check if this is in a Braita, if it's Tosefta. Yeah, it is a Tosefta. Okay, it's very classic for the Tosefta to have this back and forth discussion. Amar Rabbi Eliezer, ho'il v'chutz l'zmano pasul v'chutz l'mkomo pasul, ma chutz l'zmano kadash av chutz l'mkomo kadash. Okay, that's pretty simple. Obviously, the most intuitive thing is to compare chutz l'zmano and chutz l'mkomo. And just like chutz l'zmano is pasul, and yet kadash, okay, and yet the bread is sanctified. It's enough of a slaughtering to actually sanctify the bread. Chutz l'mkomo should be the same. Amar Rabbi Yeshua, ho'il v'chutz l'mkomo pasul u'Baal Mum pasul. He says, okay, wait, you're saying chutz l'zmano is disqualified and chutz l'mkomo is disqualified, and therefore they're the same, and therefore if chutz l'zmano, then also chutz l'mkomo. I'll give you a different case that's disqualified. How about a Baal Mum? Now everyone agrees, ma Baal Mum lo kadash. In a Baal Mum, in a blemished animal, the bread is not sanctified. So av chutz l'mkomo lo kadash. So chutz l'mkomo should be the same thing. It's not sanctified. Okay? Now, it's a bit of a strange comparison because they're very different. But hold off. So now they say, Amar lo Rabbi Eliezer, Ani dimitiu lechutz l'zmano v'ata dimitu l'Baal Mum. Okay, Rabbi Eliezer comes back with a smart retort. He says, look, I compared it to chutz l'zmano. You compared it to Baal Mum. Nireh lemi domeh. Let's have a showdown. Let's see who it's much more similar to. Im domeh lechutz l'zmano, im domeh lechutz l'zmano. If I'm right, it's similar, more similar to chutz l'zmano, then we'll do it like chutz l'zmano, like I say. And im domeh leBaal Mum, if you can prove to me it's more similar to Baal Mum, nidonenu mi Baal Mum. Now, obviously, Rabbi Eliezer notes it's definitely much more similar to chutz l'zmano. So it's chil Rabbi Eliezer ladun. So Rabbi Eliezer starts to say, okay, let's go through and let's see. Well, how are chutz l'zmano and chutz l'mkomo similar? Danim psul machshava mi psul machshava, ve'in danim psul machshava mi psul haguf. Chutz l'zmano and chutz l'mkomo are both disqualifications of thought. Right? There's nothing wrong with the animal itself. It's all in your thought, in your mind. Right? So there are disqualifications of intent. But the Baal Mum is a problem with the body. Of course, they're not similar. Okay, that's his approach. Now comes Rabbi Yeshua. Hitchil Rabbi Yeshua ladun. So now Rabbi Yeshua starts, and he says 2 points. He says, Danim psul sheyesh bo karet, mi psul sheyesh bo karet. V'al yochiach chutz l'zmano, shepsul sheyesh bo karet. He says, these are very different things. The chutz l'zmano has karet associated with it. Now you have to explain why that. Okay, I'll explain in a minute why that's relevant. But basically, he's going to say that has karet, and chutz l'mkomo doesn't have karet, and neither does a Baal Mum. Neither of them are karet. Remember, we go back to Pigul, we have to remember all of our Pigul stuff. But if we go back to Pigul, what did we learn? Pigul, there's 2 types. One is you have a thought to do it outside the time. That's the one that's karet. How do we remember this? Because the whole pasuk about Pigul was all about notar, really, about leaving it over beyond its designated time. So that's the one that's karet. If it's chutz l'mkomo, it's not karet. Now, why is that important here? Well, what he says is like this. It's not just the issue of psulo b'kodesh, not psulo b'kodesh, because also chutz l'mkomo is psulo b'kodesh. But, right, where it was fine before, it only got disqualified inside. But the slaughtering of a chutz lizmano has an advantage over the slaughtering of chutz l'mkomo, which we'll get to in a minute, because I want you to get the concept. Because it has an advantage, it's actually going to be considered a legit slaughtering enough to say the bread is sanctified, even though it's not enough to say the korban's good. Korban is not good, right? It's pigul. But why is that? Now remember, it's a little bit hard to understand this concept, but we learned about the whole thing of miratzel pigulo, if you remember, that there's ritzoi. What does that mean? It means that it's only going to be pigul, that you have karet, in a case where you did everything else the way it was supposed to be done, right? Like let's say you slaughtered it with a pigul machshava and then you didn't sprinkle the blood. So it's not going to be pigul with karet because you didn't go ahead with the rest of it the way you were supposed to. But if you sprinkle the blood properly, that's what creates it being pigul. So what does that mean, really? It means that each of these actions that you're doing, even a slaughtering that was a disqualified slaughtering for pigul, but in the end, it means the slaughtering had to be considered enough of a slaughtering to actually call it pigul, because you need everything else done properly. So it means that it's actually considered a shchita. Whereas if you do a chutz l'mkomo, we just say the korban's disqualified. There is no kared, and there is no miratzel pigulo. Everything else has to be done properly. No, because the second you do a chutz l'mkomo, the whole thing is just disqualified and done. That means the slaughtering is not a significant slaughtering, and therefore lo kadash halechem. That's the theory of Rabbi Yeshua according to Rabbi Yehuda's understanding. Okay, so that's the concept here. So that's why he specifically says here. Okay, and I'm going to share the chart again. That's why he specifically says here. Just opening it. Okay. That's why he specifically says a psul she'ein bo karet from a psul she'ein bo karet. Okay, first of all, it just happens to be a similarity, but it's an important similarity because the chutz l'mano stands out differently because it has a psul with karet, and then you have to add more because there's a ritzoi there. It's somewhat good enough to actually create an obligation of karet. Okay, that's one. Ve'od. And he says, well, now you tell me psul machshava. That's what Rabbi Eliezer, you said, right? Chutz l'mano and chutz l'mkomo are similar because they're both psul machshava as opposed to balmum, which isn't. But now he says, nidonenu mishalol lishmo shepsul machshava ve'ein bo karet. He says, and I'll give you another one. You want to say psul machshava? Well, I'll give you a psul machshava that's much more similar to chutz l'mkomo, which is lo lishmo. If you do it lo l'shem todah, what did we say? Everyone agrees, lo kadash, right? The bread is not sanctified. Why is the bread not sanctified? Because it's dresha from the pasuk. But in the end, we have two similarities to lo lishma. Number one, it's a psul machshava. Number two, it doesn't have karet. So chutz l'mkomo is much more similar to that. And with that, v'shatak Rabbi Eliezer. Okay, with that, he silences Rabbi Eliezer. Okay, Rabbi Eliezer, the big baal machloket, has nothing to say and closes his mouth. Okay, which sounds like he in the end concedes to Rabbi Yeshua about this. Okay, so again, this is all Rabbi Yehuda's approach. Okay, we have to get back to Rabbi Meir and explain the Baal Mum case. Okay, we're going to do that right now. But before we do that, let's just summarize. So Rabbi Yehuda says the big machloket is about chutz l'mkomo, and basically we're going to say that Rabbi Eliezer just thinks it's the same as chutz l'zmana, which is the most intuitive thing to say. But Rabbi Yeshua says, no, it's really not. Because of this whole ritzoi of the pigul, and the pigul, only when it's actually pigul, there's actually something happening and the lechem will be sanctified. But chutz l'mkomo is much more similar to the balmum, and perhaps in the end a combination, also the balmum and also lo lishma, because the lo lishma is the element of, well, it was just a psul in your thoughts, it was an intent issue. And the balmum, right, also has that there's no karet associated with it, but in the end, kind of strengthens his approach by saying it's actually much more similar to the case of lo lishma, which has both things. Also no karet, which means it's just disqualified, and it's a psul machshava, and because of that, Rabbi Yeshua ends up winning this debate. Okay, again, that's just Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. Now we're going to go back to Rabbi Meir. And now the Gemara is going to ask about Rabbi Meir what we didn't really understand, which is, for Rabbi Meir, ma'ishna shachata v'nimtzeit treifa, dahavi psulo kodem shchita. Right, and that's the treifa case, it was disqualified before, and that's why the bread wasn't sanctified. U'ma'ishna shachata v'nimtzeit balat mum, tilo havi psulo kodem shchita. Okay, the Baal Mum was also psulo kodem shchita, right? They're saying, was it not disqualified before shchita? And why would Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Eliezer said, Kadash halechem. So why would Rabbi Eliezer, according to Rabbi Meir, say that the lechem sanctified? It should be, the Baal Mum should be no different than the treifa. To which the Gemara answers, B'dukan shaba'ayin. Okay, what's the dukan shaba'ayin? V'aliba de Rabbi Akiva da'amari malulo yerdu. We always go back to this whenever we have a question about a Baal Mum like this. It's always answered in the same way. We're talking about a specific problem in the eye. Many different opinions of what it is. I'm not going to get into that, but there's a Rabbi Akiva holds there's a machloket about how to treat this dukan shaba'ayin because it's not a severe mum. So Rabbi Akiva holds if you brought it on the altar, you wouldn't take it off. Normally a Baal Mum, you have to take it off the altar, even if you put it on. Rabbi Akiva says you don't have to, and therefore we're going to say, remember, we keep comparing, it's the same thing. Imalulo yerdu is going to be the same, not the same thing, but whatever falls into that category is going to fall into the category of if you don't take it off the altar, then the bread will be sanctified. And that's why Rabbi Eliezer says the bread is sanctified. Rabbi Yoshua, the Gemara asks, okay, wait, if it's dukan shaba'ayin and it's according to Rabbi Akiva, imalulo yerdu, what's Rabbi Yoshua going to say? Why does Rabbi Yoshua now we're going to flip the question. Why does he say the bread is not sanctified, right? It should be sanctified according to this. To which they answer, Ki Amar Rabbi Akiva, imalulo yerdu, b'psula de gufe, aval kiddushe lechem lo. Now, until now, we've been saying the imalulo yerdu is the same as what would, right? This criteria is the same for what would sanctify the bread. Now we're going to have to answer it's not really. Okay? Because they're going to say when Rabbi Akiva said it stays on the altar, or specifically, at least in this case, Rabbi Akiva had this unique opinion about the dukan shaba'ayin. And Rabbi Akiva basically said when it comes to dukan shaba'ayin, it's enough of a blemish. It's not enough of a blemish to say that if it went on the altar, we're going to leave it there. Okay? We are going to leave it there. We're not going to take it off. However, it's enough of a blemish that it's not going to sanctify the bread that goes with it. That's basically it's yes and no. Okay, it's in between, and for one issue we'll side on that side, and the other issue we're going to side on the other side. And that's how you have to understand Rabbi Yeshua, otherwise it doesn't make sense. So the one that was the most intuitive now becomes a little less intuitive. Now we're going to move on to another machloket, which is going to be very similar. Okay, now we're moving away from a bread case, okay, and that's going to be the difference in this case, but it's going to be the same kind of idea, okay, according to Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, so maybe I'll summarize for a minute. It's a bit of a complicated sugya, so I want to make sure you have it down pat. So basically, we'll just summarize it very simply, which is we have a machloket, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua, and the question is there a machloket, according to Rabbi Meir, about the Baal Mum, which we just explained a minute ago, or is there a machloket about chutz l'mkoma, which we explained just before that, okay? Which is there a machloket about? So if you assume their machloket is about chutz l'mkoma, then you're going to see that there's another machloket about chutz l'mkoma, which is about, now in this case it's going to be about if it went on the altar, does it come off the altar? But which we assume is the same, other than the one time when we made a distinction right now. But we're going to assume it's the same thing of if it went on the altar, does it come down or not come down? It's going to be the same as is the bread sanctified or not sanctified? So Itmar. Now we're going to have a machloket between Rava and Rabba, and we're going to basically say that the machloket is the same as Rabbi Yoshua, Rabbi Eliezer. Chatan. So the first case we're going to have here, there's no machloket about. Chatan shechata chutz lizmana im alta lo tered. You have a sin offering that was slaughtered with an intent for the wrong time. Okay, again, slaughtered it thinking that I'm going to sprinkle the blood in the wrong time. Okay, or im alta, if it went anyway on the altar, which it's not supposed to, lo tered, we don't take it off because that's right. That's classic. We talked about pigul is the right. First of all, psula b'kodesh, and it's pigul, and we explain why pigul could theoretically be different. Chutz l'mkoma, if you had an intent that you're going to do it outside the right place, you're going to sprinkle the blood in the wrong location. Rava amar tered, Rabba amar lo tered. So Rava says, oh, that's already worse, right? As we said before, according to Rabbi Yoshua, again, through Rabbi Yehuda's lens. According to Rabbi Yehuda, Rava matches with Rabbi Yoshua perfectly, because chutz l'mkoma is immediately disqualified, and therefore, right, it's worse than chutz l'zmana, and we're going to take it out of the temple, right? And that's if it's on the altar, we're going to have to take it off the altar. Completely ruined. Rabba amar lo tered. Rabba says it's just like chutz l'zmana. It doesn't come off. It doesn't have to come off the altar. Again, don't put it on the altar, but if you did, you can leave it there. And that's like Rabbi Eliezer. Okay, Rava ki Rabbi Yoshua, but Rabba ki Rabbi Eliezer. Okay, but now, what happened in the debate, according to Rabbi Yehuda, between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua? In the end, shatak Rabbi Eliezer. So the first version of the Gemara says, Hadrabe Rabba legabe de Rava. Rabba must have changed his mind, though, and agreed with Rava that if you did a chutzim kamad, you're going to have to take it off the altar. Why? Midahadar Rabbi Eliezer, the Gaber to Rabbi Yeshua. Because look, Rabbi Eliezer ended up conceding to Rabbi Yeshua, so Rabba, who basically is holding like Rabbi Eliezer, probably changed his mind because of the whole end of the debate between Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Eliezer. Now, it's a little difficult, and it's probably why there's another version here. Why is it difficult? Because, it's not like time-wise, right? Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Eliezer came way before Rabba and Rava. Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Eliezer are Tanaim. Rava and Rabba are Amoraim in the third and fourth generation. Okay, Rabba's the third generation. Rabba's one generation below him, fourth. But they lived at the same time. Anyway, the point being that it's not like Rabbi Eliezer changed his mind later and then Rabba heard it. Rabba must have heard from the beginning that Rabbi Eliezer changed his mind. So it's a little bit strange. Why did he hold like him and then change his mind? So you could say maybe he didn't have that source right away and then he heard later and then he changed his mind. It's a possible way of going with it. But anyway, Ika da'am, right? A different version is to say like this. Even though Rabbi Eliezer conceded to Rabbi Yeshua, let's try to remember why. Okay? And we'll see why in a minute. We're going to say the reason why Rabbi Eliezer conceded to Rabbi Yeshua is irrelevant in the case of the sin offering. And why is that? Because what was the final line that Rabbi Yeshua had? Nidonenu mishalo lishmo. He said in the end, well, if you don't accept my other comparison to Ba'amum, I'll prove it from Shalo Lishmo. Now, what do we say about Lo Lishmo? Lo Lishmo in general is a disqualification that's in the Kodesh. So theoretically, it should be in the category of if you put it on the altar, it doesn't come off. But specifically in the Korban Toda, we don't say that. Why? Because of a special drasha. That's where we started today, right? The Shalo Lishma, because it says, Im al Zevach Todat Shlamav, on the Zevach of the Toda, specifically if it's done for the Toda. But if not, the breads won't be sanctified. So that's only relevant, okay? There he says, let's learn it from Shalo Lishmo, where in the case of Shalo Lishmo, Lo Kadash Alechem, and therefore here also, Lo Kadash Alechem. Aval Hacha, which then would, right, if we go now and apply the same thing by us in the Chatat case, Idayanet le Mishalo Lishma, Imata Lo Tered. But when it comes to a case of Shalo Lishma, in a korban, in the slaughtering of a sacrifice, it was done Shalo Lishma, we actually leave it, if someone anyway put it on the altar, we leave it there. So what do you see here? There's a distinction between Shalo Lishma in that case and Shalo Lishma in this case, and therefore, just because Rabbi Eliezer conceded to Rabbi Yeshua because of the Shalo Lishma issue, that same thing wouldn't be relevant here, because if we're going to learn it from Shalo Lishma will actually tell us it doesn't go off the altar. And then Rava could stay in his original opinion and he didn't change his mind. So we have a debate. So we basically brought this debate between Rava and Rabba, said it's exactly the same as Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Eliezer according to Rabbi Yehuda. But in the end, we tried to say, well, maybe it's not exactly the same, because either, if we say it's exactly the same, we're going to say Rabba then concedes to Rava. But maybe there's a reason to distinguish here, and maybe we would say maybe Rabba doesn't concede to Rava. Okay, new Mishnah. Now we started with this topic of the bread, and we have the slaughtering of the animal sanctifies the bread. Now we have other things that go with korbanot besides breads. We have libations. Right? Remember, you bring a mincha and wine, right? Libations that go together with a sacrifice. So now the question is, when do the libations become sanctified? And what if something happens when you're slaughtering the animal and it gets ruined, or maybe a later stage, we'll talk about that, what do we do with the libations? Okay? So, hanisachim shekadshu b'kli. Okay, this is a little tricky, because it sounds like they're sanctified in a sacred vessel. Okay, but we're going to see that that's not really what sanctifies them. V'nimtza zevach pasul. And then the korban becomes disqualified. Okay, let's say, right now it sounds like you slaughtered it, for some wrong reason, in the wrong way. The korban's disqualified. Let's say you slaughtered chutz lizmana, okay, and it's disqualified now. Im yesh zevach acher yikrivu imo. So you basically take the libations and move them to a different korban, as long as you have another korban. But im lav or im lanu, most of them change it. If you left them overnight, okay, let's say it could also be im lav. If you don't have another korban and you leave it overnight, yipaslu belina. They're disqualified overnight. Why? Because anything that's sanctified, which right now it sounds like it got sanctified in the sanctified vessel that you put it in, and now it's sanctified, you have to use it that day. So if you can't use it that day because there's no other sacrifices to put the libations with, then you're stuck and you basically have to destroy them. But now the Gemara is going to bring Ze'eri. And what Ze'eri says is going to basically contradict what this Mishnah says. Okay, and then we're going to have to resolve the contradiction. Okay, so I put it in a chart here what the contradiction is. So again, the Nisachim, Shekachu B'Kli in our Mishnah, it says, and if they were left overnight, they're disqualified. So what do you see? They're disqualified b'shchita, basically. Let's just say what we're going to learn from this. They're disqualified, let's say, when you slaughter it, and yet they are sanctified. Okay, so now, they're basically, in other words, the shchita, it sounds like the shchita is what ruined them, like the korban was disqualified at shchita, and yet these libations are still sanctified because they were disqualified overnight, if you leave them overnight. So they are sanctified, even though there was never a proper shchita done. You'll see why in a minute, why this is a problem. Because Amar Ze'eri, ein hanisachim mitkadshim ela b'shchitat hazevach. Well, Ze'eri said something that completely contradicts the Mishnah. He said, when do they become sanctified? Not when they go into the sanctified vessel, like the Mishnah said. They become sanctified at the slaughtering. Now, what kind of slaughtering is going to sanctify them? Only a kosher slaughtering. This is just like we saw in the previous sugya. If it's not a kosher slaughtering, it's not going to sanctify the bread. Again, we just depended on which one. But this sounds like if you slaughter improperly, you're not going to sanctify the zebach. And according to what we saw here, the libations. According to what we saw in the Mishnah, the libations are sanctified as soon as you put them in the bowl. So we're going to explain this. Okay, so my time. First, we're going to see what's the reason for Ze'eri. Amar Kra, Zevach unisachim. Because it says Zevach and their libations. Zevach means a sacrifice, but it also means slaughtering. So basically, it's the slaughtering that causes the sanctification to kick in. So now the Gemara says, and Tnan in our Mishnah says, contradiction. And Nisachim shkechu b'kliv v'nimtza zevach pasulim yesh zevach acher yikrivu imo. Im lanu yipaslu b'lina, my lav yipasul b'shchita. So now they're going to say, wasn't it a disqualified slaughtering? And yet they're sanctified. How could that be? If the slaughtering is no good, it's not going to sanctify the libations. To which they answer, lo de'ifsa b'zrika. We're going to say it like this. The slaughtering must have been good. Okay, we're now assuming the Mishnah doesn't mean it was sanctified in a sanctified vessel. It really only is sanctified, like Ze'eri says, at the slaughtering. But the slaughtering was totally kosher. What happened wrong was at the zrika, when you sprinkled the blood. Okay? That's the way to read the Mishnah. So now they're going to say, well, that seems to only go by one opinion. Kiman. Kirebi. Da'amal shnei dvarim hamitirim. If there's two things that permit something. Okay, basically that means you have shchita and you have zrika. Both of those have to happen in order to permit the libations to be slaughtered. So according to them, according to Rabbi, he says, when there are two dvarim hamitirim, shchita and zrika, ma'alim ze below ze. Well, even though both of them you need both of them to permit the slaughtering to permit the bringing of the libations. If you have just the shchita and not the zrika, let's say the blood spilled in between and you never do the zrika, it's sanctified in the shchita. And then that works perfectly with our Mishnah because it was slaughtered properly. You didn't have the zrika never happened, or the zrika was disqualified. Okay, it was done incorrectly. But it was sanctified the shchita because even though you have these two things which permit the libations, one of them alone can already sanctify it. This is a machlok that we saw before between him and Rabbi Lazar Rabbi Shimon. But Rabbi Lazar Rabbi Shimon says if you have shchita and zrika, they both have to be done properly in order for it to be sanctified. So if the zrika is never done properly, then it will never be sanctified, and then it won't be disqualified overnight because it was never sanctified. So obviously our Mishnah doesn't match Rabbi Lazar Rabbi Shimon. But now the Gemara says, no, afilu tema Rabbi Lazar Rabbi Shimon, we can explain it. Turning now to Amud Bet. Rabbi Lazar Rabbi Shimon say like this. Rabbi Lazar Rabbi Shimon, number one, holds you need both, right? You need shchita and you need zrika in order to sanctify. Now, what would happen here? The zrika was done wrong, so it shouldn't be sanctified. However, he holds like his father, who's who? Rabbi Shimon. We're going to come back to him later. He holds like his father who said, now in this case, there was shchita and there was kabbalat hadam. They already put the blood in the bowl. That was done properly, and then the blood spilled. That's why the zrika never happened. But he holds like his father, who said, if the blood is in the vessel, ready to be poured on the altar, it's as if it was poured on the altar already. Okay, meaning that that's enough to sanctify. Shchita and Kabbalah is enough to sanctify it, even according to Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon. So we hold you need both, but both can be a little less than Zrika. It can be already, if it's in the bowl. If it never got to the bowl, then no. But if it got to the bowl and it's ready to be sprinkled and then it spills, according to him, that will be enough to sanctify it. So what happened in the Mishnah, according to Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, is there was Shchita, there was Kabbalah, that all happened fine. That sanctified the libations, and then later the blood got spilled, never was sprinkled on the altar, and because of that, we can take these libations and move them. And if we didn't do it that day, then it's disqualified because it was sanctified. And now we've explained the Mishnah, both according to both opinions. Now what's important to understand is the next sugya, we're going to go back now and understand this line of the Mishnah. Amar mar, im yesh zevach acher yikrevu imo. And now we're going to have a problem with this, with something Rav Chisda says. Okay, we're going to have another contradiction. What's interesting about our contradictions here is it's all statements of Amoraim that don't seem to match the Mishnah. Often we have contradictions with the Mishnah. It's a Tanaitic source. This is the kind of contradiction where something in Amora says doesn't seem to jive with the simple reading of the Mishnah. Because of that, we have to read the Mishnah a little differently. So same thing happens here. But I want you to remember that if we just explain the Mishnah, both according to Rebbe and according to Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, then this next explanation, which is going to explain our Mishnah, is going to have to be according to both, and that's going to lead us to a question about Rabbi Shimon. Okay, I want you to remember where we're coming from, because what in the end they're going to say is, this sugya that we're going to learn right now must accord with Rabbi Shimon also, because we explained the whole Mishnah according to Rabbi Shimon, who, according to Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, who held like his father, and then something doesn't seem to jive, and we'll have to resolve that. So Amar, im yesh zevach acher yikrevu imo. Now they say, v'hamar Rav Chisda, shemen shefrishu l'shum mincha zeh, pasul l'shum mincha acher. Okay, they said, let's take a parallel case. We have oil that was designated for this mincha, cannot be used for another mincha. So how can you say that libations can be moved very easily from one korban to another if the oil in a mincha offering can't be? Okay? So to resolve this contradiction comes Rabbi Yanai, and Rabbi Yanai says, okay, and again I'll pull up the study guide because here we have a chart again. So here's the contradiction. Rabbi Yanai says, Lev beitim matneh alehem, im hutzruchu ve'im lav yu lezevach acher. Rabbi Yanai brings this answer, which I'll explain in a minute, and what we're going to have is two difficulties on the, okay, you can see from the study guide, two difficulties on Rabbi Yanai's answer. The first one will answer very easily, and the second one's going to be a lot of a back and forth. Answer difficulty on that, answer difficulty on that, and answer, okay? In the end, we're going to resolve it, but it's going to be a back and forth. So what does Rabbi Yanai say? Rabbi Yanai says, the reason why you can move these libations from one korban to another is because there's a built-in stipulation of the court about this. Okay, that means even if the court doesn't say it, it's just kind of a given, that whenever you designate libations for a sacrifice, if they're needed for this one, they're needed, meaning if everything goes the way it's supposed to. If not, they can be moved to another korban. And that's not the same as the oil. Okay? Now the Gemara is going to ask, why not? Ihachi shemenami, why don't we say the same thing as the oil? So if I designate oil for a mincha and the mincha gets disqualified, we can't use that oil for any other mincha. Why not? Why don't we say the same thing? The Beit Din made a t'na. You said designate this oil for the mincha. If it's used for that mincha, great. If not, we'll move it to something else. So shemen, they say ihachi shemenami. You should say the same thing for the oil. So that's the first question. So the answer, very simply, shemen gufa de minchahu. Oil is to mincha is not the same as libations are to a korban. Why? Because the oil gets mixed completely with the mincha. The mincha is made up of oil with the flour. Whereas the libations are a completely separate unit that just go along with a korban, but they're not inherent part of the korban. So that's why it's much more easy to move them around, and you can make a t'nai about them. You can't make a t'nai about the oil, which is part and parcel of the mincha. Okay, that was easy. Now we're going to get to the more complicated question. Second question. If we're already making stipulations, why don't we make a better stipulation which will resolve the other issue in the Mishnah? What was the problem in the Mishnah? Well, if we leave it overnight, it's disqualified. What kind of things get disqualified overnight? Things that are sanctified, what we call kedushat haguf. They have inherent sanctity, right? The whole object is sanctified, as opposed to what we call kedushat damim. Its value is sanctified. Now, if the value of an item is sanctified, you can basically redeem it very easily. You just, take money, put the sanctification on the money, it is removed from that item, and you're good. So, right, like if you say, I always use this example, I'm bringing a couch to the temple. I like to bring the example because you can't bring a couch to the temple who's schlepping it to the Beit HaMikdash. So what you mean really is I'm giving the value of the couch. So you take money, the value of the couch, and you give that to the temple. Okay, so why don't we just, if we're already making stipulations, why should we say a stipulation of, well, we'll use them for another korban, when in essence that means these are sanctified, and we can't remove the sanctity, so if we leave them overnight, they're going to be stuck and have to be burned. Why don't we just say, Denifku l'chulin, right? Make it tonight that if they're not used, we can redeem them, basically meaning that we're only letting the sanctification be a sanctification for their value. To which they say, Gzeira shema yomru motzimi klei sharet l'chol. Okay, so they say, well, what's the problem? It's because of a gzeira, and this starts us on the whole thing. What's the gzeira? We're worried people will see that we had these, they were sanctified in the bowl, and they were along with this korban, and then people are going to say, oh, well, anytime something's in a sanctified vessel, we can redeem it. Now, normally when something goes in a sanctified vessel, it actually becomes sanctified. Now, in this case, it doesn't, because it's the zevach u'nisachim, it's the slaughtering that makes it holy. But if we allow this stipulation, people won't know that there's a stipulation here. People won't know the whole thing. And they'll think that anytime you have something in a kli sharet, you can just redeem it with money and take the sanctity off. And no, usually you put something in a kli sharet, it has kedushat haguf. Okay, so if that's the case, now they say like this. Hashtanami gzera shema yomru nisachim shefrishan l'shum zevach zek, shevim l'shum zevach acher. If you're worried about what people are going to think, which is what you just answered, we won't let it go to chulin, well then how can we move it to another korban? People will think, anytime I take libations and I say it's going with this korban and I slaughter the animal and everything's good, maybe I could still take them and move them to another korban, because they won't know slaughter was good there, slaughter wasn't good here. They won't understand the distinction, and they'll say, oh, you can always just move around libations, which you can't. Again, once the animal's slaughtered, you can't move the libations unless it's disqualified. So the answer, Hatani Matitya ben Yehuda, Kigon shaya zevach zavuach bo'tasha. The only, now he has a braita on our Mishnah that says it's only going to work if there was already a slaughtered animal at the time. If there was an animal that was already slaughtered, ready to go, then people won't get confused and say, oh, look, you took the libations and you moved them, because they won't even realize that these libations were for this korban. They'll assume it was for the other korban, and they won't come to any misunderstanding. To which they say, okay, so now you're saying, like, so now you're saying, wait, so if you don't have another korban, then you can't use it, and then basically it's going to be left to be disqualified. Now, if that's the case, well, the Mishnah should have said that, don't you think? Right? Aditani Seifa, what did the Mishnah say? When is it disqualified? Imlanu, if you left it overnight, you paslu belina. But according to what you're saying, it should have specified in the Mishnah. The Mishnah makes no sense according to this braita Matitya ben Yehuda, because he's basically saying it doesn't depend on if you left it overnight. It depends, right, whether it's going to be disqualified or not. It depends on whether there's another sacrifice to right that at the time. If there's already an animal slaughtered, you can easily move the libations, right? But if not, you can't. So it should have said that in the Mishnah, basically. To which the Gemara answers, oh, it did. Now, where did it say it? It didn't really. Hachinami ka'amar. They're doing one of these classic rereading of the Mishnah. In what case is it referring to? If there was when can you move it to another korban? When you had a korban sitting there ready to go. If there was no animal slaughtered at the same time, it's actually not talking about psulina in the Mishnah. It's saying it's as if it was psulina and it's going to be disqualified. Okay, so to resolve the difficulty against Rabbi Yanai, we end up getting to this kind of pinned into a corner where we have to reread the Mishnah completely. Now that we're going to go back to Rabbi Shimon. Okay, Rabbi Shimon said, if you remember, again, we're now going to have to, this is what I said before, we're going to assume that this answer of Rabbi Yanai, which is basically, in order to resolve the contradiction between the Mishnah and what Rav Chisda said about the oil, we have to say that in this case there's a stipulation of the court. Okay, then we discuss why didn't they also stipulate about the oil? And that's because it doesn't work in the oil. And number two, why didn't we give a different stipulation that could go to chulin? And that's because of a gzeira. We're worried about what people are going to say. But anyway, leiv beitim matneh alehem, and therefore we can move from one to the other. Now we're assuming that Rabbi Shimon agrees with that as well, because like I said, Rabbi Shimon, we just explained the Mishnah according to Rabbi Shimon, so Rabbi Shimon would also say that. So now they say, so basically the Mishnah is based on this concept of So now the Gemara asks, wait a minute. We're now going to bring a different case where Rabbi Shimon doesn't hold, the court could just stipulate, when the rabbis do. And then we're going to say, well, why would he allow it here and not allow it there? So what's the case? The way you have to understand this is the machatzit shekel was given at the beginning of the year, right before the beginning of the year. In Adar, they started collecting machatzit shekel. They used that money to buy the korbanot for that year. Now, they would, at certain points of the year, they would take the money and go buy animals. Now, they didn't know exactly how many they were going to need. What if one's blemished? What if this? So they always bought extra. But you can't use machatzit shekel from this year for next year. So if I have animals left at the end of the year, what do I do with them? I can't use them for sacrifices for the next year. So the question is, can I redeem them? Now, there's two ways to redeem an animal. I could just redeem it because it's kedushat damim, and I could just put it in money, like we said before. Or if it's kedushat aguf, I have to wait till it gets a mum, a blemish, and only then redeem it. So that's exactly what Rabbi Shimon says. Okay, so here we have Amar Rav Idi bar Avin, Amar Rav Amram, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Tmidim shelo hutzrechu letzibur. If they didn't need them, l'divrei Rabbi Shimon ein nifdim tmimim. You can't redeem them tmimim. You have to wait till they get a mum. L'divrei chachamim nifdim tmimim. Now, why can they be redeemed tmimim? They're kedushat aguf. They're animals we bought for sacrifices. According to the chachamim, leib beit matnei alehem. They made a stipulation. We're buying 100 animals, but under the stipulation that if we only use 90, the other 10 are not sanctified. And that's why they're not sanctified kedushat aguf, only their value, and that's why we can do it. But Rabbi Shimon doesn't allow that. So the Gemara answers, don't worry, shanehatam di'ilei takanta b'riyah. There's a resolution. You can wait till it gets blemished and then redeem it. In our case, if we don't allow leib beit matnei alehem, we're going to have to destroy the libations, and therefore we're going to allow it. Okay? So we're going to allow that's a fascinating thing, which is we'll allow things when we have no choice. Okay? If the answer is going to be no completely, then we'll find a solution. Okay, excuse me. Okay. So now, sorry, trying to sneeze, it's not coming out. Okay. Let's move on now. Mishnah. Okay, I know it's late, but we'll do a little bit more. Vlad toda utmurata. Or hifrish truma v'avda v'hifrish acheret tachtea ena tuna lechem. We have 3 cases now where we have a sacrifice we're going to see. It's supposed to be sacrificed in place of that, or with the toda we're going to see, but it doesn't have bread. So what is this? Number 1, if we designate an animal for the toda, female animal, and she was pregnant and had offspring before we actually slaughtered it, the offspring gets slaughtered with it, okay, or gets slaughtered as well, not necessarily with it, but it doesn't have bread. Second one, tmurata. You're not allowed to do a tmura, which is, instead of this, I'm taking this animal, I'm swapping them. You can't do that. But if you do it, the second animal does have sanctity and has to be sacrificed. So if you say I had a toda, an animal, and then you said, I want to switch it, well, the second one has to be sacrificed as well, but not with bread. And the third is, I took an animal for the toda, I lost it, I took another one in its place, and then found the lost animal. Then, one of the animals gets brought with that bread. We'll talk about which one in a minute. Shneemal, how do we know this? V'ikriv al zevach hatoda. Hatoda tuna lechem v'lo v'lada v'lo chilufa v'lo tmurata tunim lechem. Okay, because it says with the zevach hatoda, with the toda, from there you learn only the toda gets the bread, not the vlad, not the offspring, not the chilufa, the one you brought in case it was missing, and not the tmura. Now, we'll see this all from a braita, and then we'll end at the end of this braita. Tanu Rabbanan. Ma omer. Now, we're going to darshan this pasuk, im toda yakrivenu. Now, the word yakrivenu is made up of 2 parts. Yakriv, nu. So, yakriv means slaughter, and then that sounds like a riboy. Anything is going to be slaughtered. But then the yakrivenu means it specifically is going to be slaughtered. So that's a mi'ut. We're going to talk about a riboy, we're going to expand it, then we're going to narrow it. So, toda yakriv, minayin lemafrish toda tova avda, v'frish acheret tachtev, v'nimtzet harishona, v'areshtehem omdot. How do you know that if I designate one gets lost, and then you bring the other one back, and I have 2 now before me? How do I know that? Now, this is a riboy, an expansion. I can choose whichever one I want. I don't have to take the first one. I don't have to take the second one. I can take whichever one I want and say, this is my toda, and I'm bringing it with bread. Okay, that we learn from Talmud Lomar, HaToda Yakriv. Either which way you can slaughter it. Either which one you want. Okay, well then, maybe the second one needs bread with it also. Maybe we have to do 2 with bread. Talmud Lomar Yakrivenu. Okay? Only it. Achad v'lo shnayim. So now the Gemara is going to say, Achar shriba katuv mi-8. Okay, well, there was an expansion, then there was a limitation. Minayin l'rabot v'ladot v'chalifot u'tmurot l'akravan. Now, how do we know, and this is something that kind of was implicit in the Mishnah, but we're going to now see where we get it from. How do you know that in those 3 cases, the second one, right, the tmura, the vlad, and the one that you didn't bring with the bread, does actually get sacrificed. So you might have thought maybe it just doesn't get sacrificed. How do you know it gets sacrificed? Talmud Lamar, im al toda. If on a toda, that's again an expansion. So that comes to expand to those cases that they also get sacrificed. Yachol yutu not lechem, but how do you know they don't eat bread? And with this will end. Talmud Lamar, v'hikriv al zevach hatoda. You slaughter it on the zevach, the toda. You're going to bring the breads. So, toda tuna lechem v'lo v'ladav v'lo chilfa v'lo tumar tatunim lechem. From there you learn, these don't need bread though. Okay, so we had the drasha to teach us, number one, if you brought two, one in its place and it got lost, you can choose which one you want, but only one needs bread. And then we applied this also to the Vlad and the Tmura. How do we know they all have to get sacrificed, all those three, and yet they don't need bread? And with that, we saw the Riboy and the Miud in two kind of instances, two different psukim. Okay, that finishes our daf. I know we're really late, so I'll just try to do a quick summary. We started with Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, and there are two different versions of this Mishnah about which cases the Machloket Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua about, and then we had to explain each of the Machloket between them and what was the basis of it. Is it in Chutzim Koma, or is it in the Baal Mum? Okay, then we got to a similar Machloket between them, compare Rabbi Yehuda with Rabba and Rava, and then we said maybe he changed his mind, maybe he didn't, maybe you can differentiate between the cases. Right? They love bringing similar things and then trying to differentiate. Okay, then we had the nisachim, the libations. I realized I skipped one little section. Wow, good, I went back. Okay, there's a little section before the Mishnah. Shchata shelo lishma on Amud Aleph. Amar Papa shavet tana didan el nazir deshachiach unaket el miluim. Rav Papa asked in the Mishnah, why did they pick a rare case of the miluim, which happened once in a lifetime, and they didn't talk about the el nazir, which has breads with it all the time? If you remember, the Mishnah ended with, if you did it shelo lishma lo kadash alechem. So he says, why did the Mishnah leave the more typical case of Nazir and not bring it in and brought in the Miluim, which is a rare case? So they say, Tana Didan Ikar Miltanakat. Our Tana wanted to take the main thing, meaning the first. The Miluim is the first case we ever had a korban with bread, and that's why it mentioned that one and not the Nazir. Still doesn't really answer why they ignored the Nazir case, but it does answer why that was in place of, why that was instead of it. Okay, good, I went back. Then we got to the libations and how we had this weird thing that didn't seem to match. First, we questioned it with the words of Ze'eri, who seemed to say it's only at slaughtering it only becomes sanctified, and then how could it be sanctified? This disqualified at Lina. We had to say, it was with the Zrika. We explained it both according to Rabbi and Rav Lazar, Rabbi Shimon. Then we had this other problem with Rav Chisda, who said the Shemen, the Shemincha can't be moved. Why are the Nisachim yes? And that no. We said Leib Beitim Matnei. And then we had two difficulties on that, resolved them. From there, we went back to Rabbi Shimon and said, well, he doesn't hold by this Leib Beitim Matnei. And then we said, well, yeah, he would distinguish also between the cases where he doesn't hold it and where he does. As if there's a resolution, then you don't need it. And then we got back to the Vlad, Tmura, and the Chilufa, if you replaced it with a different one. And we talked about the differentiation there. They all get sacrificed, but none of them come with bread. And we saw the drashot on that. With that, we finished for today. Wishing everyone a good day, a safe day, quiet day. And we'll meet up tomorrow as usual. And then we will break for Pesach. All the shiurim are already up on the site for anyone who wants to get ahead.